When you ask football fans what they remember about the ill-fated United Football League, chances are they're not going to remember anything. Maybe the uniforms. Owners, investors, and backers of the league included businessmen Bill Hambrick and Bill Mayer, Paul Pelosi, husband of politician Nancy Pelosi, Dallas Mavericks owner Mark Cuban, who was also bringing with him cable network HDNet, sports agent Michael Hugh, who would serve as commissioner, Google executive Tim Armstrong, Tampa Bay Rays owner Stuart Sternberg, and George Zimmer, aka the Men's Warehouse Guy. After a delay in 2008, the Startup League decided to get off the ground and take the field in 2009 with a so-called soft launch that would play games in the fall up against the NFL, but scheduling late in the week with Thursday and Friday night games primarily. The idea with the UFL was to create a second-tier group of teams underneath of the big NFL, with the likely goal of becoming their own development league, not necessarily rising up and becoming the new number one. Leagues like this have been popping up literally every year, and the history of pro football is littered with proposals that went bust, promising wild new ideas, but almost always failing to even take the field once the time to play came. The UFL was nearly alone in the fact that they actually did put it all together and create an actual, physical football league with real games and real players. And what may have gone unnoticed by some at the time was that it actually was good football. The XFL couldn't say the same, and some of that had to do with the fact that playing games in the spring means that you aren't going to get the same caliber of players as you would in the fall. This would be a league for players that had been cut from NFL camps late, had slipped through the cracks after the NFL draft, or for veterans looking to get their name back out there to maybe be signed by the NFL once the UFL season ended. It made sense. It was a real league with 4 real teams. There was a TV deal with HDNet and Versus, the network that became NBC Sports Today, and although there was talk about web deals to show live games, that proved hard to turn out because this was still right in the dawning age of streaming. But they had a media department, had professional level players, coaches, and stadiums, and uniforms. The launch logos and uniforms were undoubtedly a blunder, meant to replicate the colors of the league's logo in light blue, green, gray, and some black, but what may have seemed like a bright idea in some marketing department didn't play out well in the field, leaving confused fans asking which team was which. And the idea of a soft launch, although it may have saved a little money up front, didn't do itself any favors when it came to promoting the teams and selling tickets, leaving them with a steep hill to climb to draw in fans when it came time to reload. They started out in 4 major markets, with the New York Sentinels, coached by Ted Cottrell, the Florida Tuskers, coached by Jim Haslett, the Las Vegas Locomotives, coached by Jim Fossil, and the California Redwoods, coached by Denny Green. To test out the waters of their home markets, the teams would play their games at a variety of regional stadiums in the first year. The Redwoods played 2 home games at AT&T Park in San Francisco and 1 at Spartan Stadium in San Jose. The Tuskers played 2 home games at the Citrus Bowl in Orlando and 1 indoors at Tropicana Field in Tampa St. Pete. And the Sentinels played a game at Giant Stadium, a game at Stewart Stadium at Hofstra, and a game at Rentschler Field in Connecticut, several times going up against New York Yankees World Series games, giving them virtually no fans in the house. They were also originally scheduled to play a game at Citi Field in New York, the Met Stadium, but plans for that fell through. The UFL was run primarily with the same rules as the NFL, with a few differences that seemed like common sense fan service, like an improved overtime rule. They used many of the same features that alternate leagues had rolled out that the NFL stubbornly was staying away from, like mic'd up sidelines, in-game interviews, access to the locker room talks, and more. And the chain gang had green markers for some reason. The season was played through to its completion, with the championship game in Las Vegas won by the home Locomotives on a Graham Gano field goal. So, unlike so many of the other leagues, they had done something right and made it to the finish line. Despite some of the groaning reactions to the decision-making of the soft launch 2009 season, it led to the league approaching the sophomore year with some positive changes, now that there was evidence from a full season of football to look over. For starters, their relationship with Big Daddy, the NFL. Seeing itself as a developmental league, the UFL would put clauses into their player contracts that mandated some pretty heavy buyout numbers if an NFL team wanted to sign them, as in over $100,000 a player? To which the NFL had said, yeah, no. The number was drastically lowered and then sort of just loosely enforced. In the debut season, the teams would all practice at the same facilities in Arizona and Florida, but for 2010 would remain in their home cities and set up base camps, offices, fan clubs, etc., along with rolling out new branding to distance themselves from the league look of the launch. The California Redwoods would set up shop full-time in Sacramento as the Sacramento Mountain Lions, playing their home games at Hornet Stadium, home of the Sacramento State NCAA team, and former home of the city's CFL and World League teams. Las Vegas would remain at home at Sam Boyd Stadium, but would shift away from the Locomotives moniker and more towards the Locos with a Vegas flair. Florida Tuskers would remain in-state and retain their name, but would commit full-time to playing at the Citrus Bowl in Orlando. The New York Sentinels moved up the road to play full-time in Connecticut as the Hartford Colonials, with Rentschler Field at Yukon as their stadium. And an all-new fifth team was added to the league in Nebraska, the Omaha Nighthawks. The problem with Omaha in the past for leagues like this, kind of like Milwaukee, is that there actually isn't any notable football stadium in the city to use. No major colleges or universities, no old giant municipal stadiums. But fortunately this time around, Omaha had a one-time only offer that they couldn't refuse. Rosenblatt Stadium, the city's giant old baseball complex. Larger than AAA proportions, smaller than the MLB, and currently without a tenant. Omaha's AAA team had moved to the suburbs, and the World Series was moving to a brand new facility downtown the following year. With nothing ahead of it but demolition, the Nighthawks were given free rein of the facility, which was beloved by the local community. So much so that opening night at Rosenblatt was a hot ticket and produced what was perhaps the league's shining moment. In front of a sellout crowd of 23,000, Jeff Garcia led the Nighthawks down the field in the final minute for what was essentially a walk-off touchdown against Josh McCown and the Hartford Colonials. Highlights of the game even wound up on SportsCenter that night. Omaha had a football team. There was a buzz in the air, and after just that one game, there was even talk among community leaders that they should consider building an entire new football stadium in town. For one night, it seemed like the sky was the limit. Though some of that rainbow optimism dulled, the Nighthawks still sold out Rosenblatt in 2010 and had a pretty successful promotional campaign with a big-name quarterback like Garcia, a former NFL stud with the Packers and running back Amon Green, and a feel-good story in backup running back Maurice Clarett, the former Ohio State star who had been out of football for years while serving time in prison. After half a decade away from the game, the Nighthawks were Clarett's second chance in life, and he came out of prison a changed man. He'd play for Omaha in 2010-2011 before turning to public speaking. Sacramento was another success story. In the offseason, Denny Green had gone out and recruited Dante Culpepper to be his quarterback again, reuniting the pair from their days with the Minnesota Vikings. He was an easy promotion, and so was their running back, John David Washington. You might know him today as J.D. Washington, the name he lists in his acting credits. John David J.D. is the son of Denzel Washington, the Denzel Washington. In 4 games, they sold out 20,000-seat Hornet Stadium twice, with a low count of 13,500 against the Colonials. And the Colonials were doing okay up in Hartford. They brought in Josh McCown as their quarterback, who for the time being was out of a job in the NFL. They had decent-looking uniforms, a professional staff, and they drew all right, averaging about 14,000 fans at Yukon Stadium. The Florida Tuskers promoted their offensive coordinator to head coach, a guy who had played and coached in local Arena League teams for years. It was his first head coaching job in full-size outdoor football, and wouldn't be his last. A good example of talent being nurtured by the UFL. It was Jay Gruden. He had veteran quarterback Chris Greisen under center, a guy who last took a snap in the NFL in the year 2000, and has since played across the country in arena leagues and across the pond in NFL Europe. Greisen would use his time in the UFL to springboard back into the National Football League, twice signing with the Dallas Cowboys, though he'd never take a snap. They also had former Colts stud Dominic Rhodes as their running back, and would lead a successful campaign in 2010, going all the way to the championship game, but drawing weak crowds to the Citrus Bowl and only cracking to the 10,000 mark once. Las Vegas was meant to be the centerpiece of the league, a team in a city that was eternally being brought up as a home for alternative leagues, and the home team of Bill Hambrick, the league's heavy hitter in the financial department. Despite that, they were having a hard time drawing a crowd at Sam Boyd Stadium, hovering around the 9,000 mark for most of the season. If opening night in Omaha was the high-water mark of the season, the 2010 championship game back in Omaha was a close second. The final ever sporting event at Old Rosenblatt Stadium was a neutral-site game between the powerhouses of Las Vegas and Florida. Everything seemed to be headed down the right path for success. The game was nationally televised, drew 15,000 fans, impressive for a neutral-site game in a brand new league, and featured a potential future league star in Locos quarterback Chase Clement, the game's MVP. Everything seemed to be headed to success. The model seemed to be working. People were tuning in, teams were drawing fans organically, attendance was up now that the teams had settled into more permanent homes. The Omaha Nighthawks averaged more than 20,000 fans per game. Sacramento wasn't far behind. Florida was a work in progress. Overall, the league counted 300,000 fans in attendance over 20 games. For 2011, serious league expansion was on the table. Familiar faces were trickling in. During the 2010 season, the Tuskers announced that former Redskins great Joe Theismann was stepping in as the new president and owner of the club. Speaking with the team, he also dropped word that the team was going to be set up in the Hampton Roads area of Virginia in 2011, and that their quarterback might be Jamarcus Russell. Jim Spiros, a businessman who had owned the Baltimore Stallions during the CFL's expansion to the U.S., was mentioned as the owner of that team. There was a constant rumor of a potential team in Portland, Oregon. There was talk that a team was going to be placed in San Antonio, owned by old icon Red McCombs, but there was a conflict with the Alamo Dome over exposure versus UTSA, which had just begun its football program there, and the availability of other area stadiums. Chattanooga, Des Moines, and Wichita were potential future markets, and there was some talk about Salt Lake City getting a team, potentially as a new home for the Locos, who had been struggling at the gate. Virginia Beach was officially added as a sixth team, with head coach Joe Moglia, a man who had coached football in a previous life but up until recently had actually been the CEO of TD Ameritrade and was an extremely wealthy man. Former NFL coach, college coach, and NASCAR driver Jerry Glanville was brought on to be the new head coach and GM of the Colonials. His quarterback was going to be Colt Brennan, a household name for college football fans, former star at Hawaii, Glanville's old stomping ground. Things seemed to be on the right track. And then the house of cards started to crumble. Behind the scenes, things hadn't actually been carrying on too smoothly, and it became obvious that in certain areas of the league, the wrong people had been put in charge. As successful as the Omaha Nighthawks were at the box office, they'd been ruffling a few feathers around town. Employees weren't happy with some of the treatment, various vendors weren't being paid, and there was an increasing feeling of arrogance from the top of the organization. The initial hysteria was winding down. But what really sent the league spinning off its axis in 2011 was the possibility looming of being the only game in town. The NFL was looking at a potential lockout situation, and at the time, it almost seemed inevitable. We were going to witness football season, at least to start, without the National Football League taking the field. Pinch hitting for the NFL would be the UFL, swooping in to save the day, scooping up some star players who just wanted to play ball, and scooping up potential owners. The next part of the story contains some speculation, but I think it holds water and stands up to the truth of what was going on behind the scenes at the top of the UFL at the time. The heads of the league realized that they were going to be in a position to see a serious windfall if the UFL was the only show in town, and language in the ownership models maybe wasn't quite what it was then at the league's inception, now that it was becoming obvious that the pie they'd be taking a piece out of was going to be a whole lot bigger. Maybe they got greedy. But the potential owners began to drop out. Mark Cuban tapped out. Joe Theismann quietly disappeared from the Tuskers. Jim Spiros put up a fight in Virginia, but eventually took his ball and went back home. To make up for the difference, the Tuskers left Florida and became the new team in Virginia Beach, the Destroyers, dropping the league back down to 5 teams. Despite all the talk of expansion, 2011 would see the league schedule look very similar to the year before. And then the checks stopped clearing. The big issue started cropping up. Sam Boyd Stadium in Vegas wasn't getting along with the Locos, but there wasn't any sort of secondary stadium in the area that they could play at, other than the aging AAA baseball complex. So the Locos were forced to gut it out there another year. The Colonials were having similar rent issues in Hartford, potentially looking at other stadiums in the area outside of Rentschler Field, but larger problems were looming. The Colonials had shown up to Hartford ready to go, ready to practice, but were stranded in the hotel. Vague financial issues were stated, the usual, checks in the mail were dotting the I's and crossing the T's, but apparently the situation was ugly, clear down to the bone. The team itself, all of its equipment and uniforms, had been repoed and was locked down. The Colonial season was canceled, owner Bill Mayer shifted his ownership to the Virginia Beach Destroyers, and just like that, the league was back down to 4 teams. Despite the fiasco in Hartford, Virginia Beach had made a valid attempt. They're moving into the Virginia Beach Sportsplex, a decent multi-purpose kind of stadium that had hosted some pro teams across a number of different sports over the years. The Destroyers even added a picnic pavilion and an entire second grandstand on the opposite side of the field to boost capacity at the stadium. When the shuffling began, they brought in NFL veteran Marty Schottenheimer as head coach and moved Joe Moglia to the Omaha Nighthawks. Hey, Omaha, that's where TD Ameritrade's headquarters are. With Rosenblatt Stadium getting the wrecking ball, and with no other suitable football stadiums in the city, the Nighthawks were moving into the shiny new baseball stadium that was built for the College World Series, which was TD Ameritrade Park. Leads you to believe that the league's interest in Joe Moglia went a little beyond his coaching ability, maybe? Ironically, though, Moglia's interest was squarely as a football coach, and he's a pretty good one. He helmed the Nighthawks for 1 season, then took the head coaching job at Coastal Carolina University, where as of 2018 he's led them to a 56-22 record and a trip up the ladder to full FBS status. As it turned out, the NFL season went on as scheduled, and the UFL brass's gamble of going all in on the lockout went bust. There were some good steps made, namely being able to focus on local broadcasts and regional markets for games, rather than relying on occasionally obscure TV networks. But overall, the season went on as a disappointment. And after 2011, Commissioner and frequent punching bag Michael Hughes fell on his sword. The Nighthawks were playing in the fancy new baseball stadium, but there wasn't much of a fan turnout. Without the history of Rosenblatt, this was just an awkward fit. They brought in former Nebraska legend Eric Crouch to quarterback the team, but he was years removed from playing professional level football and didn't last too long. The season was finished out by Jeremiah Masoli, who wound up actually becoming a star in the CFL years later. The Virginia Destroyers were a decent success, playing as the old Tuskers with a few new faces. And the Mountain Lions were continuing to draw well, but the rumor was that despite the packed grandstands, there were very few actual tickets being sold to the games. And out in Las Vegas, attendance was cratering. Whatever efforts the Mountain Lions had been making to paper the stadium had been given up on by the Locos, despite the efforts of coach Jim Fossil to promote the team in the area like his life depended on it. Events from the 2011 and 2012 seasons blended together in a blurry, bizarre sequence of misery. Thanks to the lack of cash infusions from new owners, the long-timers and executives had to come up with a new strategy to stay afloat after heavy losses in their wallets. Their solution was simply to stop paying people. Not just secondary vendors and lower staff members, I mean serious bills. The stadiums weren't happy. In Virginia Beach, the league had set up shop in an office in the new downtown that served no purpose other than flashy visibility and a manner of flushing money straight down the drain. Players weren't paid. Coaches weren't paid. Denny Green wasn't being paid, but he still coached through the end of the 2011 season before suing the league for $1 million. Sadly, he would never collect and died in 2016 at age 67. The Mountain Lions as a whole went into the tank. In 2012, they moved to Raleigh Field, Sacramento's AAA baseball stadium. The checks from the league were drying up entirely, and morale among the team was sinking. Players were walking away, and the ones that stuck around were eating meals of hot dogs and pots of stew in the locker room. Their salaries had been slashed to a few $1,000s a game, but when it came time to sign, Pelosi only doled out $1,000 each. Over in Virginia Beach, fan support had started out strong in 2011, with big crowds coming to see the first pro football team in the region in ages, but frustration started to mount when the schedule began to be tinkered with. Did I not mention that? In 2011, the schedule was temporarily pushed back, then shortened midway through the season. In 2012, the season was shortened midway through the season. In both cases, a hasty championship game was called to be played during one of the regular home dates in Virginia Beach. And despite the constant changes, the team still attracted 14,000 fans to the finale of the abbreviated 2011 season, but was never able to replicate that energy again. Instead, the league started to lash out, even threatening the Destroyers fan club with legal action when they were the first to break the possible news of a shortened season. They'd take up a similar beef with a sports reporter in Philadelphia, who also had the nerve to correctly speculate on the league's end. And after the 2011 season, head coach Marty Schottenheimer would depart, also citing lack of payments. Las Vegas was in a world of hurt. Jim Fossil was still coaching, Chase Clement was still his quarterback, but with zero advertising budget and bad word of mouth, the team had become invisible. 2,500 fans showed up for the first game in 2012, and in the second only produced an announced attendance of 601 in a stadium that seats 35,000. There had been constant rumors for the past 2 years that the team was poised to move a state away to Salt Lake City, but head honcho Bill Hambrick stayed the course, going down with the ship in Vegas. Towards the end of the 2012 season, nobody was being paid. The lawsuits were mounting, and it was clear that unless something major changed at the top, the league would be folding at any given moment. The murmurs of new teams were drying up. Jerry Glanville was sent to poke around Jackson, Mississippi, but despite insistence that they were on the verge of fielding a team, the Jackson announcement never came. Good news seemed to be on the horizon, though, a spark that might save the league. During one of the rare national telecasts, the league's brass promised a news release from the broadcast booth at halftime. Would it be a new ownership group? A shift to the spring? New teams? More games? Something? Anything? No. The league got up in front of the cameras in the middle of a game, put on their serious face, and told the folks at home that they were working on delivering on their contracts and ensuring that the paychecks were going out. Yikes. Not exactly the formula for a vote of confidence. And after the Snap Championship game in 2012, the league essentially disappeared. There was a brief, muddy announcement about picking up play in the spring of 2013, but those plans never materialized. In addition to the staff and coaches, dozens of players filed lawsuits against Hambrick and the league for payment. For their part, Hambrick, Mayer, and the rest of the gang, vanished. Some of the legal matters were settled, many were not. None of the parties involved at the top have since been involved in professional sports in any way since the league folded. The teams and their branding went away as well, with some equipment still sitting in storage lockers today. There was talk at one point not long after 2012 that an indoor team would use the Sacramento Mountain Lions branding and keep the team going in their league, but like so many other things associated with UFL, it never happened. It's a shame that the United Football League went down, and went down with such a whimper, because it was the closest thing that the country had had for a second legitimate football league in ages. But in the end is barely remembered among football fans, and turned off markets and investors for years to come. And despite the early successes, it begs the question, do we even want a second league under the NFL? Fans watch college football, but then turn on lower leagues in the Canadian game because they don't want to watch a bunch of scrubs, despite teams being made up of the very players you were just watching on Saturday. Media members would gleefully go out of their way to talk about how little they cared about the league, all while reminiscing about the good times that the XFL never really had. But some good did come out of the UFL's big mess. It showed that there was a formula for creating sustainable lower-level leagues, and it would come in lowering expectations and focus on smaller, mid-market cities away from the NFL. A major league city is a major league city. Even without major league teams, at least at the time, Las Vegas was still a major league city. But places like Omaha, Virginia Beach, and Sacramento, with the right operations, could draw 15 to 20,000 people a game, so perhaps the same could be said about Salt Lake City, El Paso, Wichita, and some of the other towns that had been mentioned as potential sites. It's all a darn shame because the UFL was very, very close to making it as the number 2 football league. If they hadn't bet on the lockout, and maybe had a few different people calling the shots across the league and up top, it could still be going on today, but instead, it faded from sports memory almost as soon as the final whistle blew.